Welcome to the Unknown Warrior podcast with Pete and Jason from Squeaky Pedal. Very happy today to say we're joined by Peter Francis from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So thank you, Pete, for joining us. Much appreciated your time to discuss some all things Unknown Warrior and grave registration and all those things that are in your knowledge house, as it were. So thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So we've done a few episodes now and kind of talking about various aspects of the Unknown Warrior and kind of the bodies that were chosen and the people that were involved. But one of the things we kind of wanted to go through with you was the process and the admin kind of behind that, because it's a really interesting process of kind of, how that all started and where that all came from. So we know when we've spoken to people in the previous episode, we've spoken about the Directorate of Graves Registration and Inquiry, which is kind of almost the precursor to CWGC, right? It's kind of that, almost the starting point, but there's a bit of a muddy kind of waters in between how that became the Imperial War Commission and then how that kind of turned into you guys. So do you want to just explain to us kind of how that kind of ended up being started after the First World War, or during the First World War even, and then kind of how it morphed into what you guys are, and what you guys do today?
Absolutely, yeah, no problems at all. So I think it's difficult because we've all grown up with remembrance and we've kind of grown up with an acceptance that you commemorate your fallen servicemen. So appreciate that actually before the First World War and even at its start, that concept was completely alien to the British Army. So it had no processes in place for dealing with large-scale casualties. It certainly had no intention of commemorating them in perpetuity. It's not kind of what the British Army had done before. I always tell a little bit of a story about the Battle of Waterloo. You know, at the end of the Battle of Waterloo, the dead were simply kind of covered in lime and thrown into pits and forgotten. And a few years later, many of them were exhumed. And when you ask younger people why that was, they kind of go, to bring the bodies home or to give them a decent burial. The truth's a bit more shocking. They were burnt so that the ashes could be used as fertilizer and the teeth were taken to make dentures. So there's such a thing as Waterloo teeth, would you believe? So it's only 100 years later that our attitude to the army has started to change. And it's because the First World War, I think, is so different. You know, for the first time, this is a volunteer citizen army. It's no longer an army on the fringes of empire. They will say an unpopular army, a policing empire. It's an inclusive one. It's an army made up of our fathers, our brothers, our sporting heroes and things like that. And when it starts to suffer massive casualties, the British public begin to demand something be done to recognise that loss. And out of that kind of chaos, you have almost this kind of cometh the hour, cometh the man figure called Fabian Ware, who becomes the Commission's founder. And he'd been a newspaper man. He'd reported on the Boer War, and he'd seen the kind of distress that had caused to relatives with no final resting place. And so although he goes out to France to kind of command a unit of the Red Cross, his unit very, very quickly starts to take on this role of marking and caring for graves as they come across them. And by 1915, he's believed that this work is so important, he starts to push the army to put it on a more formal footing. And although there's some reluctance to begin with, they kind of yield to it. And they create initially the Army Graves Registration Commission, which then becomes the Directorate of Grave Registration and Inquiries. And it's Fabian Ware at its head. So he's got this hat on, he's kind of got this military hat on, but he's still concerned about what's going to happen to the bodies once the war's over. And so at the same time, he's pushing in the background for this independent organisation that becomes the Imperial, now Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And that's approved by a War Charter on the 21st of May, 1917. And he's the vice chairman of that. So he's kind of wearing these two hats. And he's still wearing those two hats by the time you get to 1920 and the Unknown Warrior practicality. So you're absolutely right, Pete. There is a bit of confusion. Directorate of Grave Registration and is more the army. The Imperial War Graves Commission is a kind of a standalone unit in its own right. And inevitably, perhaps there's just a little bit of crossover in the early days as the commission starts to take over increasing responsibility from that directorate and starts to try and bring permanency to the commemoration of the war dead. So I tend to like to think of the DGRE as the kind of practical stuff, you know, the recovering the bodies, all of the paperwork that kind of sits now in our archives. And the commission is kind of the memorialization bit of the kind of equation, if that makes it any simpler for people to understand.
And how were the bodies being recorded and buried initially during the war?
Probably, if at all, Jason, it was really by their units. So you might have a dedicated army chaplain who would do the best he could. small kind of regimental cemeteries kind of were established near the front line or behind the front lines. But of course, huge numbers of bodies simply weren't being recovered at all. It was far too dangerous to do so. And so lots of them were simply lying out in no man's land or being destroyed by subsequent fighting. There wasn't any systematic process in place to mark places of burial, even to mark the graves permanently. And that's what Ware brings to the table. So he brings a process. He starts to establish regulations and rules for where cemeteries should be sited. And one of the things that I find remarkable about him is long before the war is over and before the war is even certain to be won by the Brits and her French allies, he's negotiating for permanent cemeteries. So he obviously has this vision, and he starts to negotiate for the permanency of commemoration of the dead. He also starts to establish kind of principles, which again, we now take for granted. So this idea that we would treat everybody equally, regardless of their rank. And also that to do so, we wouldn't repatriate the dead. So very early on in the war, you know, some of the more wealthy families had managed to repatriate their loved ones. And there's perhaps the last really high profile example is Gladstone's grandson is repatriated by the family and brought back to the family vault. And this absolutely horrifies Ware. He thinks that's not right. And so he pushes the French to kind of bring in this banning order while the war is on, which means that actually the bodies are going to stay in France. Then when the commission is established, that's kind of brought in as a principle. And of course, that's hugely controversial because in effect, what you're doing is almost kind of state-controlled bereavement. And what you have in our archive is these letters from grieving mothers, which actually break your heart. You know, I sent my son off to war, you've taken him from me, and now you're not even going to let me have his body back. And I think that's why the Commission's history and policies are so important to the story of the unknown warrior, because you can't divorce one from the other. You have to see it within that context. So what he comes to represent has to be seen in the context of that. Most of our physical focus for remembrance is actually overseas and not here in the hub of empire.
There's so many letters that were written to, various parts of government and the Imperial War Graves Commission. As you say, that kind of put pressure, wasn't it, to kind of, that then the powers that be thought, okay, maybe we do need to sort something out here because we can't repatriate anyone. And as you say, the letters from mothers and sisters and fathers and, all sorts of things. Just there's a kind of a push towards the kind of unknown warrior and the cenotaph that kind of was building for a little bit before it kind of came to be.
One of the things that I often say to people is that one of the reasons why we remember the two world wars is because for the very first time, you've got something to focus your remembrance on. As human beings, we're kind of strange creatures, aren't we? We often need to be able to touch something or visit it or see it. Before we believe it. We're kind of the doubting Thomases, aren't we, if to take the biblical kind of reference. And I think you're absolutely right, Pete, because there are war graves here in the UK, and one does start to see kind of springing up of memorials, but that lack of having something to focus that grief on, which must have been so raw, even in 1920, 2 years after the war had kind of ended, means that the unknown warrior and the cenotaph just take on that added significance. You look at 1919 and that first peace day, as it was known then, commemoration, and in the middle of the summer rather than in winter time, and obviously with a temporary cenotaph as opposed to the permanent. It was that reaction to it, wasn't it? The public reaction to it, which I think took people by surprise. And of course, at the same time, the Commission is still battling this rather powerful opposition about what it's trying to do. And for a time being, in 1920, it looks like we're not even going to be able to do anything at all. The Commission's history, again, we tend to take for granted, but it was a real near-run thing. We nearly didn't exist at all. 1920, there's this big parliamentary debate. Fabian Ware is even concerned when you read his kind of private notes that he's not even convinced our own chairman, who's a guy called Winston Churchill, by the way, is backing the Commission. And it takes a lot of work between him and kind of people like Rudyard Kipling in the background to kind of win them over to the vision that they have for a fitting commemoration of our war dead. And that parliamentary debate, when you read the minutes in Hansard, it's bitter, it's raw. And the House divides without reaching a conclusion. It's not like we win, but it's really interesting then because I think the circumstances or the practicalities of things on the ground start to overtake the debate. So you have the cenotaph being made permanent, you have the unknown warrior, but you also have the first 3 commission cemeteries, the kind of experimental cemeteries are taking shape. And there's this lovely report in the Times newspaper at the time, which talks about actually what a noble and beautiful places these cemeteries are. And then the opposition starts to filter away. And the commission starts to embark on what Rudyard Kipling called the biggest single bit of work since the pharaohs, and they only worked in their own country.
It's fascinating. I mean, you talk there about these cemeteries being set up, and a lot of them, the graves are concentrated from different places into one place to gather all the bodies together. What was the reasoning behind that, to sort of concentrate all those into one place?
Yes, there are different types of cemeteries, Jason, and one of the fun things is kind of learning how to read one of our cemeteries, if I can put it that way. So we do have what we call battlefield cemeteries. They tend to be smaller. You tend to perhaps have a higher proportion of unknown burials in them. The graves probably won't be in neat and ordered rows. They might be kind of higgledy-piggledy throughout the cemetery, because it kind of reflects the fact that it was built in a hurry. So Polygon Wood Cemetery in Belgium is a really good example. You know, you're talking just over 40 graves. It's kind of an unusual shape. The burials kind of face in different directions and things like that. So you can tell it was a battlefield cemetery. And then you've got the really, really big ones that kind of sitting next to kind of hospitals, and what we kind of call hospital or dressing station cemeteries. So the graves tend to be really closely packed in them. Much higher proportion of identified burials, because obviously by the time the person had made it to the hospital, they kind of knew who they were treating. And they tend to be very neat and ordered, but the headstones are often touching. Lissenhoek Cemetery in Belgium is a really good example, because they weren't digging individual graves; they were almost digging trenches. They were digging, they were dealing with so many casualties. But when the war is over, you've still got all these kind of small cemeteries dotted across the Western Front. And although the French and Belgian governments are hugely generous to the Commission in terms of land, people are starting to move back into their farms and starting to re-establish their lives. And so most of those smaller cemeteries and the isolated burials were concentrated into the bigger cemeteries that you see today to guarantee their care and maintenance. So Tynecott is perhaps the best example. Tynecott's perhaps it is the biggest commissioned cemetery in the world. It's perhaps the best known, best visited. The original burials only number a couple of hundred, and they're around where the Cross of Sacrifice now is at the top of the cemetery. But the cemetery itself contains, 12,000 graves. But the vast majority of those were brought in between 1918 and 1921 by these grave concentration units who were doing, I think, kind of the unsung heroes of the Commission's history. They were usually men of the Pioneer Corps. The Chinese Labour Corps played a significant role as well. And they had the thoroughly unpleasant task of going out into the battlefields and trying to find, recover and identify the dead. And every single headstone that bears a name is testament to their dedication and their skill in those very, very difficult and trying circumstances. They literally divided the battlefields up into grids and walked them time and time again. So if anyone's ever kind of seen one of those kind of police lineups when they're kind of, walking across a field looking for evidence, it was a bit like that. They became expert at kind of spotting, a burial location, perhaps, there's a bit of lush undergrowth, there's possibly a burial there. They also did some rather, I guess for want of a better word, more graphic things too. They would have metal poles which they would sink into the ground and then, smell the end of to see again whether or not there was a body there. So one can only imagine what it must have been like for them. But my God, they did a bloody good job.
Yeah, it must have been not an easy day's work, that is it. And so when they were doing this, then where did that approach to that come from then? Was that just something that they developed? I don't want, not skill set in that, but they got, developed that kind of grid system, and they kind of just, as you say, and you learn over time that to notice different things. Was that just something that they developed because it was a relatively kind of new approach almost, is it? I don't know how you want to phrase it, but
yeah, no, pretty much, Pete. I mean, that's kind of how it was. They kind of learned as they went along, and then I guess slowly but surely, in very typical British fashion, those things then started to get written down and become guidelines and principles. So there are instruction booklets to officers of grave registration and concentration units, and it talks about, so don't build a cemetery near a water supply, for example. It's all the practical stuff like that. It talks about what the men should do in terms of keeping themselves clean. They wash themselves in creosote and things like that. But yeah, it starts to become established, and it's really interesting. The units themselves become so expert. They can spot different shades of khaki, and they can spot differences between the uniforms of the various Commonwealth countries, and anything they can do to identify someone, they do. And I think, again, something that's really interesting, is perhaps sometimes overlooked, is the actual identity tag system that we now know, the dog tags. Before 1916, soldiers only wore one, and it was common practice to remove it when that person was killed as proof they'd been killed. Well, great, you've just taken away the best chance you have of identifying that person. And it's Fabian Ware who insists that there should be two, and it's something that was stayed with the army and indeed armed forces around the world to this day. So again, they would look for those. They're made of a compressed fibre. They're supposed to be rot-proof and bright and flame-proof, but they burn and they rot. So they very rarely survive. But again, lots of soldiers, would have their own ones made of metal. And sometimes those would give a clue, but perhaps it would be a letter. It would be just, a date stamp on a piece of uniform. What's really fascinating is in the Commission archive, we have a photographic album from one of these units doing this work in 1946 in Normandy. And for us, it's almost like a pictorial step-by-step about how the cemeteries came into being. It's a fascinating insight. And, do check out the Commission's archive. It's got all sorts of gems in there, and it's completely open to the public. We're more than happy to let people have a look at those things.
Yeah, speaking about the archive, you've got a lot of the burial return documents in relation to the bodies that are being recovered and then put in cemeteries. How were those bodies that were recovered recorded when they were laid to rest in cemeteries?
So literally, as I said, the battlefield was divided up into a grid system. So the map system used the old trench map system, so with grave references and things. They're sometimes referred to, so we have versions of them. The Imperial War Museum has copies of them as well. They're sometimes referred to as body density maps. They should more correctly be referred to as cross density maps, because what the counting is actually the number of crosses in a particular grid. And when a body was found, the NCO or officer would be called, and he would start to establish the paperwork process. So he would start to note the grid reference at which the body was found. Was there anything in particular that led to a particular identification? All of this would be mapped down, and then where that body was taken to, so that you have that chain of custody from start to finish. So you'll see that for bodies that have always been in a cemetery, there won't be as much information as for a body that was concentrated into a cemetery. So if you look at the Commission's paperwork, you'll sometimes have something which says previous place of burial, and it will give you this grid reference from where the body was found on the battlefield. And it's fascinating. There's some really good software out there now which helps you to kind of map those grid references to modern day, maps like Google Maps and things like that. So you can actually work out where people were brought in from which battlefields. But yeah, a huge process. The Commission's records originally stretched about 20 kilometres in length. It's that sort of sheer amount of paperwork. And it was only back in, 1995 that all of our casualty records were digitised and kind of then made available in 1998 on the website. It's only fairly recently that paper system was moved to a completely digital system, because, the paper system served us pretty well for decades. It was limiting. You had to kind of know who you were looking for. So you couldn't, for example, say how many captains were killed on the first day of the Somme, where of course now with a computer database, you can do exactly that. So it is interesting the way things have come on. And indeed, people talk a lot about DNA and DNA being the holy grail of identification. I would say equally as important is the availability of records online and the availability to cross-reference those records. They play a huge part in the kind of investigative process that, our commemorations team do back in Maidenhead in Berkshire, where our head HQ is, and equally our member governments around the world.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that's what kind of astounds you really about the whole paperwork process, and obviously when that began, as when we're talking about around the time of the Unknown Warrior and stuff, that just colossal amount of manpower, and that kind of, you can't find information, as you just said. Now you can go online and search for, how many captains were killed on a certain day or whatever like that. But it's just mind-boggling, really, to me, that colossal amount of work and those colossal amount of people and that colossal amount of paperwork was just generated for that. And then that's someone's job to document and record all that. It's a weird thing to think, isn't it, in the kind of internet age that we are in now, and the digital age.
You're absolutely right. Thousands of clerks typing away, making lists, even the process of making the registers. This was actually Rudyard Kipling's idea. He wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to find the grave of their loved one. So every cemetery has a register with the burials in it. And those registers were printed and made available, to libraries all across the Commonwealth. That process on its own was enormous. It's one of the things about the Commission, when you start to examine it in pure terms of scale, it is extraordinary. We sometimes joke a little bit back in Maidenhead when we say, we mow the equivalent of 1,000 football pitches worth of grass every week. Some of your listeners might be keen gardeners. They might measure their borders at home in metres. We measure ours in kilometres. It's that scale of what we're doing. But at the bottom of it, though, is the fact we're a deeply human organisation, and behind every single headstone there's a human story just waiting to be told, and that's what I really like about it. We are preserving the names and the memory of individuals. It's not just about scale.
And the work that you guys do, it's not just just after the First World War, just after the Second World War. It continues right up to this very day, with bodies that are still being discovered and being exhumed and being buried in cemeteries. So the way that the bodies were identified in 1920 is different to now. What other methods and tools do you use now if you come across a body to try and identify who that individual may be?
Yeah, so we get probably about 40 cases a year now, Jason, on the Western Front, former Western Front, I should say. And most of them are kind of accidental finds. It's, farmers ploughing fields, or it's perhaps as towns and cities expand into what were once former battlefields. There's a hospital site, for example. Well, I should say it's going to be a hospital. It's a building site at the moment, just outside Lens in France. And over the last 12, 18 months, that's been a location where we've had significant numbers of finds. And because the Commission has offices on the ground in France and Belgium, we've got excellent relationships with those authorities. And there is a process in place. So in France, we have what we call exhumation officers. And if a set of remains are found, the local police are always informed, first of all, so they can satisfy themselves they're not dealing with a present-day homicide, that it is actually historical. And if it is, then they'll call our team, and they quite literally will drop whatever they were doing, and they will go out and they will recover those remains. They do so to an archaeological standard. Everything is photographed and catalogued and brought back to our mortuary at Arras. So yeah, we have mortuaries. And in the mortuary, everything is examined again photographed, and we put together a report, which we then submit to the relevant government. So most of them tend to be UK, MOD, and we would send them a report with our findings and anything that we can work out. So our commemorations team, again in Maidenhead, will do a kind of initial trawl through our records. So say, for example, we're lucky enough to find a regimental association for an individual. We'll do a little bit of work to say, well, that regiment was only in that area at this particular time. And of the 50 or so, say, people who were killed, 27 of them are identified burials already. So there's a potential pool of candidates for 23 who might be that individual. And that kind of just sets the ball in motion, as it were. In Belgium, it's slightly different. We don't have exhumation officers in Belgium. Most of the recoveries are done by local archaeologists on behalf of the state, and then the remains are handed to us. But then the rest of the process is exactly the same. The member government will begin the investigation. If DNA is practical and viable, then they will use it. But as I was saying earlier, it's not the Holy Grail everybody thinks it is. You do need an idea of who the individual is before you can go out and find some family to compare that DNA sample to. So I kind of use the analogy, it's a bit like trying to do a jigsaw puzzle, but without a picture on the box. So you don't really know where you're going to end up. And then the cases can take, many years to reach a successful conclusion. But regardless of whether or not that individual is identified or not, they are buried in the most appropriate Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery in which we have space. So we try to treat them as if they were found in 1918, and we try to bury them with their mates, so that you have that context. We're not removing them out of context. But yeah, certainly the number of identifications over the last 20 years that I've been at the Commission has increased massively. And again, it's not just one thing. It's not just advances in DNA. It is the ability to cross-reference records. And then we've had really kind of unusual things like Fromelles back in 2010, when we were actually managing the recovery of 6 mass graves containing 250 Australian and British soldiers whose resting place for whatever time was missed by one of those grave registration units in the 1918s. And yeah, we had to build a brand new cemetery because we didn't have one that could take that many individuals. So for the first time in 50 years, we were actually building a new cemetery. So Framel's perhaps the exception to the rule, but it was still a really fascinating project to see that come to life. And I think if you'd asked us at the start of that project, how many of these guys will you name, we'd probably maybe say 10 or so. And today it's more than half. I think the figure stands at about 160. Something of them have been given their identity. So, 10, 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. But now with the advances in science, it is.
That's absolutely fascinating.
That's amazing, yeah.
And I was going to ask you also a little bit about the unknown warriors that exist now in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, because that's a fascinating story in of itself, how those unknown warriors came to be.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I think we tend to think of them as a fairly modern idea, but particularly in Australia and New Zealand's cases, they actually raised it in 1920. So straight after the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, both Australia and New Zealand considered whether or not they should have their own. And it was quietly kind of forgotten and dropped until much, much later. So the Australian unknown warrior was in 1993. The Canadian was in 2000, and in New Zealand 2004. So fairly recently that those nations have requested a repatriation, and it's the one time when the Commission actually has allowed repatriation of remains in a modern circumstance. So agreements had to be reached. We then were involved in the selection process for all 3 because we had to identify appropriate cemeteries and potential grave concentrations that would work. So by that I mean, actually finding a cemetery in which you had significant numbers of unknowns of that nationality to guarantee the sanctity of the process so that they would also remain unknown. So that was the kind of key to it. So yeah, it was quite complex, but hugely rewarding and really interesting to see the way all 3 were received in their home countries. I think we tend to forget, don't we, that they are quite literally thousands and thousands of miles away from where most of their troops served and fought and died. And again, I think it's important that, they had their own focal point in the hearts of each of those countries, just to kind of remind, particularly that next generation, of the contribution that their men and women had made so far away from home.
That's the fascinating thing about the idea of the unknown warrior and the one in Westminster Abbey and the other ones we just mentioned, like that idea still carries on, and you can still, as you just said, that the Australian one in the 90s and then the Canadian one after that this idea still carries on, and even you could do this process in the modern era and it still holds the same kind of gravitas and the same poignancy that the original idea still had. I think that's really, it's not usual in this modern world, and maybe that kind of is the case. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's a testament to kind of I know Jace has been to of your guys' cemeteries in France, and I've been to a few, and I've been to the workshop near Arras as well, which is really fascinating to kind of go around there. And I think, as you say, you mentioned earlier on that the CWC really puts that kind of human element back into this kind of process. I think that's really important.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it also shows just what a great idea it was back in 1920. I mean, fair play to David Railton, the Reverend who came up with the idea. It just was a good idea. It is still a good idea. You can see the impact that it still has on people to this day. It's very much a reminder that we fought 2 terrible wars. They had to be fought, but they fought to such an extent that individuals lost their identity. And it's the genius of the Kipling inscription, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God, unknown but known. I often look at those. It's interesting when I visit one of our cemeteries, I'm drawn to the unknowns for some reason, and I kind of wonder who they were and things like that. And we do the same when we visit the tombs of the unknown warriors, whether it's in Westminster Abbey or the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. It's the fact that they are all of us, I think, is the real power behind each of those places.
It's a fascinating and enduring symbol, and it's been really nice to explore that in its centenary year this year, really, and have it brought to the fore a little bit more. So, Peter, thank you so much for appearing on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you and fascinating to hear a little bit about the Commission's work in a bit more detail. So, thanks very much.
Absolute pleasure, guys. Pleasure to speak to you.